Hi, everyone. Welcome to the final week of the 2023 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Jenny Rushlow, Dean of the Maverick Lloyd School for the Environment, and we're very pleased to welcome you to the presentation today. Each of these talks is worth one Vermont CLE credit, and you can keep track of the talks that you attend for your records. And we'll have time for Q&A after the presentation today. If you're watching on the VLGS YouTube or Facebook pages, you can enter questions in the chat or comment space at any time during the talk, and we'll get through as many as we can at the end of the presentation. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Gina Warren. Professor Warren is the A.L. O'Quinn Chair in Environmental Studies and co-director of the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center at the University of Houston Law Center. Before joining the Law Center in 2016, she taught at Texas A&M University School of Law and Duquesne University School of Law. And prior to joining academia, Professor Warren was in private practice for several years, working as a litigator in land use, environment, and utility law for Perkins Coie in Seattle, as well as a litigator in a prominent regional firm, Post and Shell, based in Philadelphia. Professor Warren's teaching and scholarship focus on the nexus between the environment, property, social justice, and energy. And her scholarship has appeared in top 20 law review journals, books, and peer-reviewed journals. And she's authored a book chapter on U.S.-Mexico relations in energy and the environment. And her scholarship has been excerpted in prominent energy and renewable energy textbooks. Professor Warren joins us this summer as our Distinguished Energy Law Summer Scholar at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And today she'll present a talk titled The Unwanted Neighbor, How Indoor Cannabis Cultivators Raise Environmental Justice Concerns. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gina Warren.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and present my work and to have been here for 2 weeks. This is my second week in Vermont. It's been lovely and wonderful, and I really appreciate all of the warm welcome and help and everything that I've gotten here. And so obviously I want to thank everybody at the Vermont Law School and Graduate School. Jenny Rushlow, thank you so much for everything you've done. Kevin Jones, Guinevere Byrne, Ben Verardi, Jenny Carter, everyone at the Institute for Energy and the Environment, and all the wonderful students, interns, and fellows. It's such an amazing program, and so glad to have been part of it. So let me share my screen, and hopefully all goes well. All right. So today I'll be talking about marijuana and environmental justice. And so this, I want to kind of take a little bit of a step back because I want to tell you where my research has started and what has happened over the years, and kind of give you a little bit of a rundown of where my perspective and where I've come from on this. So I started off writing this piece in 2015. And at the time, there was no one writing in the area of energy and marijuana. And this was an opportunity for me to do something fun and interesting. And so I was looking at 4 states at the time. And so those of you familiar with cannabis marijuana law know that it is huge now, right? So it's many, many, many states, the majority of states, in fact. But at the time, there were only 4. So Washington, Oregon, Colorado, and Alaska were the only 4 that had fully legalized for recreational marijuana. And so it was a little bit of an easier task of just looking at those 4 states to see what they were doing with regard to energy and environmental issues. And so when I was practicing in Washington, one of my one of my clients was a utility company that supplied electricity to people in the Northwest. And one of their concerns was that they were seeing a major spike in energy demand, electricity demand for indoor cultivation. And so I started looking at how much electricity does it actually consume to cultivate indoors. Okay. And so the question is, or the answer is actually, it's a lot. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly how much. The numbers are not necessarily easy to obtain, but we know that it's quite substantial. And that's because it has to be generating electricity in general. It has to be a facility will consume electricity 24 hours a day as they're cultivating for indoors. And so just by comparison, there were some numbers that came out that it was somewhere around 70 times that of a commercial building. It was one of the most energy intensive industries in the United States, still is probably. You have data centers and Bitcoin and all of that, which might be surpassing it, and also electric vehicles. But in general, it's one of the most energy intensive industries in the United States and still is today. As an example, you have like a 5,000 square foot facility that if it was a standard office building or a standard household, it would be about 66 times that of a average household. And so all of these statistics, these are not coming from me. These are coming from people who try to calculate this and try to do some level of understanding about how much energy it takes to cultivate indoors. So that comes from lighting, the requirement for a certain amount of moisture control, including CO2 control, temperature control. All of these things require a lot of energy, and it's highly energy intensive for indoor cultivating. And so, I was trying to come up with some solution to this. Obviously, as an academic, all you can do is kind of put it together and have some ideas and some recommendations. But one thing that I had encouraged is to mandate through the licensing schemes clean energy. And so the thought that, well, instead of consuming at the time, maybe I have it on another slide, but at the time, I think it was like, for example, 75% of Colorado's electricity was coming from fossil fuels. And so, well, if we could at least shift that to clean energy, maybe that would help. And then I realized that there wasn't enough clean energy. So we didn't have enough clean energy either on the grid or on-site availability to actually power the needs of the indoor cannabis grows. And so then I'm like, okay, well, if you can't mandate it, maybe we'll pay a fee, and it'll be maybe on a sliding scale, encouraging people to become more and more energy efficient and more use of clean energy. So that was 2015. So that's where it all kind of started. And then I took a break from marijuana because I didn't feel like I had a whole lot more to say at that point, until I was invited to do a piece by Boston University. And they were looking for kind of an update to see what had happened since then. So that had been about 7 years. And I said, absolutely. It sounded fun to me. My husband helped me come up with this title. So I thought it was something that I'm always looking for, some fun title that will help me with the law review students. So this was a fun one my husband came up with. But so I started looking at the time and I'm like, wow, okay. So now 2021 at that point, there were 15 states plus District of Columbia that have fully legalized for recreational marijuana. So now I had a lot more states to look at, and I could see what it was that they had been doing and whether there were any new regulations and requirements for clean energy or energy efficiency of some sort. And so I looked at 3 states, and those 3 states, Massachusetts, Illinois, and California, had either in their original licensing scheme or in a supplemental new, updated version. California is the updated version, had some sort of energy efficiency mandate, whether it was for lighting or for having environmental reviews or something like that. So, and then California has a climate intensity, emissions intensity requirement now. And so I started looking at this, and I was a little surprised that only 3 states had really taken this on to that degree. And so and there was still this concern that the energy demand in the United States just generally, and then for marijuana grows as well, and more specifically, was just continuing to increase. And so for that piece, I looked at those 3 states, I looked at what they were doing, and it looked as if there were 2 primary concerns that were immediate concerns for indoor growers. And so one of those is grid vulnerability, and the other is greenhouse gas emissions. And so, so I took some time to take a look at what some of the utilities were talking about as to what the vulnerabilities were. And in general, those were just due to increased demand, and that there was a risk of blackouts or rolling blackouts, brownouts, and increased surges of power demand. There was also something I hadn't considered, is that the more energy demand you have, the more stress you're putting on the grid itself, the more equipment replacement you're going to need. And the sooner that the transformers could potentially blow or equipment needs to be replaced. And they were starting to see a lot of that. In particular, Oregon PG&E was reporting that. And so just this strain on our grid, which is already frankly pretty vulnerable to begin with, because we don't have the redundancies and the transmission interconnections that we need. So that was one part. And then the consideration of the greenhouse gas emissions, and that our electric system is responsible for 1/3 or so of all of the emissions in the world. I mean, in the United States, that contribute to the world emissions. And at the time, like I said, we had come down to about 60% fossil fuels for electricity consumption. I think they're still around 80% for total. But for electricity, we had done a decent job of bringing in more renewables. And I think that I was trying to actually look at it right before this, but I think we're really close still to this number as of 2022 as well. But so when you're talking about increasing electricity demand, and you have a fossil fuel majority system, that can result in significant greenhouse gas emissions. And so any kind of higher electricity consumption can be a problem. And this is all obviously at a time where the IPCC is saying, we need to decrease energy demand, and we need to lower those emissions from the energy supply. And so it was creating this issue. It still is. And so that's what I was looking at the time. And I made this recommendation because this became the most obvious. So there's a researcher from Berkeley. He's now on his, I think on his own, but David Mills, who is very prominent in this area. And he was encouraging me at the time to consider that you can't fix this by having just better energy efficiency and using renewable energy. That really just needs to go back outdoors where it belongs. And I came to believe that that was true. That I think that this is a very difficult problem to solve as a status quo. We currently have about 60% of our grows are indoors. A lot of that is because that it's mandated by states to be indoors. So you can have states that require it for security reasons. And then you can also have it to where the growers desire it to some level because they can maintain very precise growing environments for it. But regardless, as it appears that this is not a problem that can be addressed by just better energy standards and those types of things. It really needs to get back outdoors. And so that's still my number one, is getting the word out that it should be grown outdoors. Now, I did have students asking, and we were talking about this yesterday, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, is that I don't know how much land it would take to actually grow it outdoors. And I tried to do some searching today to see if I could tell, and it wasn't readily accessible to me. But that is an interesting question that we'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute. But absent that, if we're still requiring most cultivators to be indoors, then again, I'm still recommending at this time that there be a clean energy mandate, and that we utilize more clean energy, more efficiency, and all of those things. And then, right, when you do that, when you increase the regulatory framework and requirements and obstacles, you then create a more expensive industry. And so no question that that's one of the negative things about increasing regulation, is that it creates additional barriers. And Genevieve Byrne wrote a great piece on this, on energy inequity in cannabis cultivation, recognizing that the more regulations and the more mandates and obligations there are, the more difficult it is to get into the industry. And so trying to offset that, at some point, I also was recommending state utilities that could maybe provide incentives or rebates or grants or something to try to offset those costs that are quite substantial in switching to clean energy or clean energy, more sustainable technology. So that's where I was. So that's what happened up to about 6 months ago, I guess. And about 6 months ago, I applied for a fellowship through the Elizabeth Rockwell Fellowship at the University of Houston. And I wanted to write on environmental justice and the ethics of decision making. And so I submitted a proposal, and it was accepted, and I received this fellowship. And then I was like, oh man, now what am I going to write about? And so I started just really brainstorming what I wanted to write about for environmental justice. And offhand, I said, okay, well, let me just Google environmental justice and cannabis or marijuana. And lo and behold, there were things that came up. And so I started looking at it. And so this is the new project that I'm doing right now. And my teaching was purchased and bought out by the Elizabeth Rockwell Fellowship. And then this wonderful scholarship that I received from Vermont is helping facilitate the research that's gone into this. So thank you so much to everyone. And hopefully we can come up with something great. So then to 2023, a couple years later, now you've got 23 states plus DC, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands have fully legalized recreationally, right? That's all that I'm continuing to talk about, even though it's still federally illegal. So, so this is where I started my research on this and started thinking about these cases that I found that were suing cultivators, indoor cultivators that were located in urban communities in Oakland. And so there were 3 environmental justice cases that were against indoor cultivators. And I tried to put the citations here if you're interested in looking this up. All but one of the first 2 are still ongoing. The third one has been dismissed because there was an injunction granted. But the allegations look like this. The indoor cultivators are exposing the community, which is identified a community of color that already suffers from high rates of adverse health conditions, to dangerous toxic pollutants due to diesel generators. And so what was happening in these communities was that there wasn't enough electricity to run the facility. And so they were bringing these huge semi-tractor trailers to the facility and running them 24/7. Well, obviously, if you run diesel generators 24/7, you're going to create a lot of pollution. This is actually one of the reasons why there was a movement to legalize, is to prevent some of the generators that were off grid from running, because it's much better at least to put them on the electric grid. But so what was happening though is there just wasn't enough electricity, or that was at least the allegation, and that was what they were saying. And so, like you can see on this Green Sage management case, that they were running 9 of these semi-sized diesel generators 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for over 2 years, which had created a significant amount of pollution. And so that's the allegations of these 3 cases. Like I said, this third case, they received a federal injunction. And so this case was dismissed. The Oakland started basically instituting a requirement to where they went and did audits all around to make sure that no one was continuing to run these generators, but the first 2 cases are still ongoing at this point. And so then I started looking at it a little bit more, because a lot more people had, scientists and environmentalists and researchers had been actually looking at some of the other threats that indoor cultivation can cause. And so there were basically in these categories of biological threats, chemical threats, and then those standard pollution threats that I was talking about. But then they added a couple other areas like ozone, and then odor and particulates and other things as well. And so this is, again, not my work. This is work that's been done by some great researchers who are looking to see the actual negative externalities of these indoor grows. So you have biological threats due to the heat, the mold, the bacteria, the fungus, and the allergens. And then chemical threats from carbon dioxide and monoxide, and fertilizers and pesticides and things like that are used indoors. And then the pollution threats, obviously the greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions, ozone, and odor. And then there is a very small number of academics that are looking at the social threats, some concerns about the zoning restrictions that are going on. And I have some of that in my article that I'm happy to talk about. But so zoning restrictions, basically, it depends on who's there first. So if they put in a facility and there's zoning restrictions that you can't have a school located within a certain distance, or a childcare center, a rehabilitation center, or a medical facility, or something like that, then what can happen is that it can prevent investments in that community. It also can have the result of decreasing property values. And there was a concern that it would increase. There are a couple pieces that looked at whether dispensaries increased vice concerns. And that didn't look like it panned out at all, but it really would be pretty irrelevant to, I believe, to a indoor cultivation facility. And so, but these are the types of threats that can result from a indoor cultivation facility being located in a community. And so, so how did this turn into what would be considered like an environmental justice issue? And so I just want to bring you back around to the fact that it appears, and there's still a lot of research that needs to be done in this area, but these cases are coming up because they're locating these facilities in historically disadvantaged communities. And so the communities that have already been disadvantaged by a lot of refineries and infrastructure and railroads and historic waste sites and all kinds of things. And it depends on how the state identifies its environmental justice community. But in general, it's communities that have already suffered a disadvantage, and now we're bringing in another facility to also then create additional pollution. And so environmental justice is a grassroots movement that started along with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And so it has evolved through the years. You'll see like energy justice, environmental justice, climate justice, all of the things that have evolved from it. But the bottom line is where we live matters. And so there's a study that was done in Houston that identified that an individual's zip code is actually a stronger predictor than genetics of how long they'll live. And that's a result of their environment dictating their well-being. And so when an individual lives in an area with high pollution and a lack of financial resources, then that can also result in a lack of access to opportunities like education, employment, and among other things. And so a lot of states are looking at this. The federal government is looking at it through their Justice 40 program and all of those things. But for our purposes, I want to focus on three different injustices. The first is the environmental injustice, where you have the disproportionate exposure of marginalized communities to the environmental hazards. So, for example, in the United States, Black people are exposed to 21% more pollution, even though they produce 23% less pollution personally, individually. And so that's your disproportionate exposure. If you look at it from an energy perspective, it's also highly disproportionate that the cost of energy delivery and utilization, as opposed to the amount of money that the person would make. And so according to the Department of Energy, the poorest families in our country are paying upwards of 30% of their income for energy costs. And so while the more you make, those energy costs aren't as severe, the less you make, it can end up being about 30% of your income going to energy costs, whether it's for cooling, heating, transportation, and whatever it is. And so these are the injustices that I discuss in the types of categories we've put things into that I'll discuss in the article. But now I've come up with this new term, which we'll see set of terms. We'll see if this actually flies with anybody and say this is the worst idea ever. But now you have, if I'm looking at this, I have the cannabis cultivation injustice, where you have a disproportionate exposure of marginalized communities to environmental hazards caused by the indoor marijuana cultivation, while simultaneously hindering access to its financial benefits. And so that's where I'm moving toward. And you can tell me if you think that that's a crazy way to identify it. But when I look at ownership of cannabis businesses, you have a number which I actually feel like it seems high from some of the other ones that I saw, but it's from a report in 2023 that it was 15.4% was owned by non-white individuals or companies, shareholders. And this is due, as Genevieve Burns said, in part due to high capital costs of entry and barriers to licensing eligibility for various reasons. And so when you have generally environmental pollution, energy inequity, and a lack of access to ownership, and then you have more specifically putting the polluting facilities in the environmental justice communities that are not owned by members of that community. This is what I'm trying to figure out how to at least make some level of recommendations for. And so I went to the big think tank with the Vermont faculty and the energy clinic students. And I've had quite a few discussions with everyone. And thank you so much for your time and your interest in this project. And these are, we spoke for quite a while yesterday and came up with some pretty good and interesting ideas, and that I really want to expand on in this article. So the first, obviously, is incentivizing outdoor grows, right? We really need to incentivize growing outdoors, even though if that's not done correctly, there can also be environmental issues and land use issues and all of those things. But at least we would be moving in the right direction. So incentivizing outdoor grows in some way would be beneficial. Another area that we talked about is increasing tax on indoor growers. And one student talked about maybe this could be a sliding scale depending on your size, the facility size and energy consumption. And so the bigger the facility, the more tax they would pay, which that could just be, it's generally related to like your revenue, but it could be related in this instance to energy use or some other measure for energy or environmental issue. And then the key though would be to place that money in a fund that would help facilitate social equity programs. So to allow for more access for ownership. And so I think Boulder, Colorado has a pretty interesting fund that does some of this, but I don't think it necessarily helps facilitate, and I might be wrong, but if I remember right, I don't know if it facilitates ownership. It does facilitate social justice movements, helping the community, giving back, those types of things. But I think that it should be more direct with helping access for ownership. And so placing that in a fund for grants and things like that. So another great idea is placing limits on the size of indoor grows in urban areas. So this could be done through zoning. This could be done just through, licensing or whatever it is, but you could try to minimize to where it's not the huge, massive facilities. It's more of a smaller set of of indoor grows. Some of the concerns with that could be that where would you place them as well? Where would they go? And then also another concern could be that you have a cumulative effect that would be potentially the same as just having larger grows. But something definitely to consider, limiting the size. Now, some state licensing requirements do limit how big and how many, how much, the quantity and size of the grows. So that could be something that could be considered. And then another one that came up, and this came up a couple times when I was talking to Ben and when I was talking to some of the students, but having some level of a community benefit agreement. And so, community benefits agreements and then, or an informal like social license to operate, those came out of the energy sector where US companies would go to foreign locations and want to develop and exploit the natural resource there. And they would either enter into formal community benefit agreements or social license to operate where they get the input from the community. These, I think, are very promising, a very promising concept for marijuana and indoor grows. I think that it's something that would encourage the participation of the community and hopefully get benefits back to the community. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. A few years ago, I looked at sporting events, so like mega sporting events and their impact on the community. And I recommended that the host communities enter into, community benefits agreements and work on decreasing displacement and all of the things that would come along with hosting this type of a huge mega sporting event. I hadn't considered until I was speaking to people here that maybe that's something that would be really good to consider and bring it in for the indoor marijuana cultivation. So Ben turned me on to the Massachusetts host community agreement provision. And I took a look at that yesterday, and I was looking at it still again this morning because I wasn't familiar with this until he mentioned it. And also I had a student mention it too yesterday. But the Massachusetts, it looks like, might be one of the only states to actually call it this. And so I find it interesting that they were calling it a host community agreement. But I looked at some of the particulars, and at first glance, I saw some problems with it as to what I would want it to function like. Because first of all, it's between the municipality and the grower. It's not between the grower and the community. And so it's basically an agreement between the municipality and the grower to encourage good behavior. And so it uses the term encourage municipality to consider the costs and the benefits of the indoor grow facility. And so it encourages them to look at what might be beneficial to the community, what might be detrimental to it, including environmental issues, but it doesn't require it. It just encourages them. It says that the agreement may include provisions for local jobs. So encouraging the community to have some level of investment in the employment there. It may include community support and outreach programs. So putting funding into those or putting forward new programs for community outreach support. And then it also may include an additional 3% tax for community impacts, but it didn't look like the community actually receives those benefits specifically. And so again, I really need to go back and take a look at this better. I need to understand more if this is a model that could be used or how it needs to be fixed. But at first glance, we need to have the agreement be between the municipality, the grower, and the community. It means you have to define what the community is, but not just encourage the municipality to consider the costs or and the benefits, but require that they do so. And then also include provisions for local jobs, provisions for potential royalties, potential ownership, and those types of things. And so I really want to go back. I'd be very interested if anybody knows of any other host community type provisions in any of the other state statutes, but and licensing schemes, but I'd be very interested in looking at this. So I'll probably take this one and try to come up with a model that might work. And so, just as an overarching conclusion, we need to decrease the negative externalities of these indoor cultivation facilities while increasing community involvement, decision-making, access, and benefits. So at the same time, so that's where I'm at, and I would love to hear any feedback. Happy to answer any questions that I might be able to answer. And I really, really appreciate your time and listening to me.
Thank you, Gina. Super interesting. And so to our viewers, we do have time for Q&A now. So you can enter your questions in the chat or the comment space, and we'll get to as many as we can. So Gina, you talked about some of the ways in which one of the solutions might be to urge these industrial facilities to move toward using clean energy as their energy source. And in some states, due to the way that rate making works, and that would mean that ratepayers would be paying more money for their energy in order to finance rebates and grants that would be paying this kind of new luxury industry to do the right thing in terms of clean energy. And I was just thinking about the fact that this is particularly rich when these facilities are located in environmental justice communities, which are being disproportionately targeted for drug crime prosecution. So it's sort of like, we're going to haul you off to jail for drug crimes, and we're going to locate a drug facility in your neighborhood that you benefit from not at all, and you're paying for to make it not pollute and make you sick. So that's an intense problem.
I think you said it quite well. Yes. And that's a serious issue. And then on top of a lack of access, so not being able to have ownership or potentially even employment at those facilities.
Yeah. And it seems particularly hard to stomach when this is essentially a new industry. And, I was thinking when you were showing the community benefits agreement framework in Massachusetts, the cannabis industry has developed in Massachusetts at pretty much the exact same time that environmental justice policy has evolved in Massachusetts, having lived and worked there during that period of time. And so it's possible one of the reasons that the Cannabis Commission thought to do community benefit agreements is that at the same time there was, EJ policies being implemented. But you would think with the development of a new industry, essentially, that this is an opportunity to get it right the first time. And yet it seems like we're replicating the same industrial environmental justice impacts with this new industry that we've seen with every other industry in EJ communities.
I think that's right. And I think it's been like that from the beginning. I remember when I first presented this this type of concept of regulating indoor growers for clean energy and these types of things in 2015, that I received a lot of pushback. And it's like, well, why are you being unfair to these communities? I mean, these cultivators, when everybody's doing this, why don't, and the answer is, that's right. I mean, everybody should be doing better, right? This should be a broad opportunity to do something better. And maybe, I think Ben told me yesterday, maybe this is a model that we can use when we think about it. But I always just thought of it as an opportunity. So you have a new industry, and now we have an opportunity to do something right. And we're not, is what I'm seeing. And I usually, after I give presentations, I get calls and emails from people who are doing well. And it's not to ever take their credit away, because there are cannabis growers who are doing the right thing, and they're doing really well, and they are being thoughtful. They are using energy efficient lighting. They are caring about the community that they're in, and all of those things. And so I never mean it to be that no one in the industry is doing this or to disparage at all. It's just to encourage, as it's being developed, that we consider the things that are starting to become more obvious as we legalize.
A question about zoning for these facilities. So, part of what creates environmental justice problems is zoning or lack thereof, and the proximity of facilities like this to residential communities. So I have two questions about that. One is, are these facilities typically categorized as industrial or manufacturing facilities for zoning purposes? And also, what are we seeing in terms of the application of agricultural zoning exemptions for these facilities? Because I know in Massachusetts, there is a zoning exemption for, qualifying agricultural operations. There's tax benefits for certain kinds of agricultural operations.
So great questions. The zoning is all over the place. And so is really the licensing for these at the municipality level. So there are places that can say, we don't want any, and zone them out and say there cannot be any in their community. And you'll see that in California in particular that I've looked at, where you could have a community that says no indoor marijuana cultivation in our community. And then that will push it into another community, which is one of the issues in Oakland, is because it pushes them into a community that would be more historically accepting, or at least not creating as much backlash by putting them with other polluters that are also already in there. So you could see zoning where they're zoned out completely. You could see zoning where you have to be within a certain distance of usually it's going to be like childcare or schools, churches, those types of things. And then what I've also seen is, in general, they're considered commercial buildings. There can be, yeah. So
are they selling at these facilities? They're selling at dispensaries, right?
Yeah, so the dispensaries would be your business zoning, but these are being industrial and then sometimes commercial zoning for the cultivators. And then you can also see where I've seen a couple of times that there are conditional use permit requirements. So maybe it's zoned, it's allowed to be, but then they have to go through a conditional use permit to be able to operate there. So it's all over the place. That the one thing that you asked me though about how is it zoned compared to other agriculture uses, and I don't know that answer. So Jessica Owley is a professor who did a lot of work on this in a rural environment, and I actually just was pulling her stuff to go back and take a look and see if she talked about the zoning for it. but I think that that's an interesting question because, and that came up yesterday when I was talking to the students too about whether this should be just like any other indoor agricultural facility.
Yeah.
But those are definitely interesting questions that I would like to look into a little bit more as to whether that would actually help or make a difference. I don't believe, I remember doing research on indoor hydroponic kind of agriculture and how that compares to indoor marijuana, and they're not similar in the amount of energy and pollution and those types of things. But it would be an interesting question to look at and see.
Are there any analogs here to tobacco production or, any of the legal struggles that the tobacco industry has faced?
So not with the indoor cultivation. The only vice type industry that would be similar would be the indoor brewing company or distilleries.
Mhm.
So because tobacco is going to be grown, I don't know, I'm not aware of much indoor tobacco growing at all, if at all.
Yeah.
But distilleries and breweries have come up in my research as to the amount, whether there's any similarities with those, and that they definitely, Colorado did a study on this and definitely not similar, not
Okay.
similar enough to make any. I think the only thing that would be similar is an indoor hydroponic
Mhm.
agricultural facility. I think that would be the only thing that would be close.
Right.
Um,
Which perhaps we'll see more of, with the climate crisis,
That's right. Yeah.
causing the impacts that it is to agriculture.
Yeah. The more severe the weather, the more extremes that you're seeing, the more likely. Yeah. I agree.
Question from the audience. In your ideal world, would these considerations be ruled into presumably forthcoming federal legalization measures or better enacted and enforced at the state level?
So I don't know. I guess you could always have a state implementation plan. If you had federal legalization, maybe you would have a model and then the states would implement that. But I guess I would be more inclined to think about, and this is just off the cuff, I need to probably think about it a little more than I am, but I would think that the states would want to regulate this because it is more location based, I would think, and their comprehensive plans and what they are looking for. I can say that the web of regulation at the local level, it has really resulted in a lot of inequities, it seems, where one jurisdiction is saying no, and then that pushes it to another jurisdiction, and then you have that that one that is getting all of the negative externalities. But I mean, they're also getting, I guess, the revenue and the benefits too. But so the web of crazy regulations at the local level, I think, is causing some problems. I'm not sure that the state level, it's really causing as many problems, but and so I think that that's what I would say. I guess I would have to think about it. I could be encouraged probably in any direction. So
I think that makes sense. Okay, I think we'll wrap up there so that folks can get to their 1 o'clock classes. Thank you, Professor Warren. That was a really interesting presentation. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Our final talk of the summer will be this Thursday at noon online, and we'll hope to see you then. Thank you.
thanks, everyone.